This is the legend of a man named Godwin. From a young age, Godwin was an ambitious boy with enormous potential. Excelling early on in musical performances and academic ventures, Godwin pursued opportunity after opportunity with great zeal and enthusiasm. Science was always on his mind, which led him to pursue a Bachelor of Health Sciences at McMaster University and a Master's of Science in Molecular Biology at l'Université de Montréal. Godwin would become a researching powerhouse in the world of science. Godwin was happy. And then something marvelous would happen. Something that would change his life forever. Where do we begin? It wasn't really one day, but rather a series of days, weeks, months. So it's pretty difficult to pinpoint exactly when it happened. But it happened. And it's still happening. See, the legend of Godwin is a rich, diverse legend. It would not be fair to say that he's merely a scientist. No. He's much more than that. At some point in his life, he made the jump from academia into venture capitalism. But it's also not entirely accurate to say that Godwin is merely a venture capitalist. He's much more than that. Perhaps it is better for Godwin himself to tell that legend. What does matter is that the story of Godwin is a legendary one. From science to venture capitalism to content creation to podcasting and everything in between, Godwin has paved his own adventure, his own journey, his own legend. This is the legend of Godwin Chan. Godwin, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. And let me tell you, the intro has been really amazing. I don't really usually talk about myself like that, but thank you for the intro.
Hey, you're very, very welcome, and thanks for coming on. So this episode, and really the next series of episodes, is about 20 years in the making. 20 years in the making. Now, why do I say that? Because we've known each other actually for over 20 years, right? We've known each other since probably around kindergarten or grade 1, that sort of equivalent.
Early childhood, basically.
Yeah, very early childhood. So the fact of the matter is, this is sort of a culmination of all of our conversations put together over the years. And the thing is, the conversations that we have are atypical of our age group, or for most guys, if you think about it that way. Like, we talk about philosophy.
What most people like to talk about. Yes.
Yeah. Like we talk about mostly about philosophy, causality, and all these esoteric niche areas, academic areas. I mean, I don't really want to call myself an academic because I'm not, but it's basically reaching down to the deeper ideas, the very intense kind of subjects that we have over the course of time. So really, the episodes that we do here are pretty much going to be that similar reign, honestly.
Absolutely. Can't wait. It's going to be exciting.
Yeah. So before we get into that, though, let's go to the very, very beginning. What inspires you to go into health sciences?
Great question. So I think this is a very common thread for a lot of Asian children, including ourselves. Maybe not as much yourself back in the day, but especially for me and a lot of my peers. For me, the natural sciences, or just sciences in general, was just something that was interesting to me. It never really was, something that I was like, I wanted to do this or to do that, but it was just something that I really liked studying in school. It was something that came naturally to me, just all the STEM subjects really, in general. Maybe not engineering because I didn't actually go, or computer science because I didn't go into that route, but definitely the natural sciences. So biology, chemistry, physics, math, everything that stereotypically an Asian would be good at. those were the subjects I relished in, and frankly excelled at school, kind of growing up. And why the health sciences in particular, that is mainly because I think of the influences of my paternal grandmother, actually. So she was a practicing physician in Macau, which is also where she still resides. And she had her own private clinic and ran that for many, many years. And so I got an opportunity in when I was like really young, when I was about 2 to 5 years old, in between that time, to go visit that clinic and to play around with the stethoscope and maybe not try on the lab coat or the physician coat, but rather to kind of observe and see where what the happenings of a clinic or a doctor's office was really like. And that was where that spark of interest and curiosity in health sciences really came from. And growing up, that kind of like longing or that interest in health sciences, or especially in the medical field, became more prominent. And that was what I thought, that I wanted to do for the rest of my life. And looking back retrospectively, it is interesting because I would consider, or I would say that most people actually, even by the end of their high school years or they graduate, when they're 18, most people don't really know what they want to do, which is very normal. For me, I thought, I had this laser focus on one and one thing only, was to get into medical school, become a physician. And that was what I catered my high school career to, or my time in school, taking more and more STEM subjects. What I did for my extracurriculars, in particular, volunteering at local hospital. And if anyone is from Mississauga, you would know that it is, well, I actually volunteered at Trillium before it became THP, or Trillium Health Partners, when all the sites came together. But I was actually at the Mississauga Hospital, which is what is known as now. And I was born at Carter Valley, actually. So there's another fun fact for you. So if anyone doubts my Canadianness, I am very born and raised in Mississauga, actually. So, but anyways, that was kind of the catalyst, and then it proceeded to coming to apply to different universities or post-secondary programs. And whereas most people, or a lot of other people, would consider maybe like 2 or 3 different majors or fields of study that they wanted to pursue, and apply to different programs and kind of spread their interests around, I decided that I was only going to do one type of degree and one type of program, which is the life, health, and medical sciences. Whatever university provided that type of program, I was going to apply for, and I applied to a bunch of those. And at the end of the day, it came down to McMaster University, which is based in Hamilton, here in Ontario, here in Canada, and the University of Toronto, or U of T, St. George campus, which is downtown. And I could have gone either way, honestly, on that decision. U of T actually gave me more scholarship money. Fun fact, but at the end, I did make the choice to go to McMaster. There were a few reasons for that. One was I wanted an opportunity to go away from home, or to live away from my parents, and for the first time, to teach me valuable life skills. Second is, I don't know, for some reason, McMaster just resonated with me more. It was a very esoteric kind of feeling. There's like, I can't really describe it. It's just, it felt more homey in a way. Perhaps that's probably because McMaster is actually in a close, well, it's not really an enclosed campus, but it's has a more campus feel than, say, like St. George, which is basically in the middle of downtown Toronto, if you haven't been there before. And so there's no real separation of campus area and the rest of the city, because it's kind of embedded in the middle. And so that's kind of like how I went and kind of like went into that journey of health sciences at McMaster. But there's a common kind of misconception that, well, yes, of course I did graduate with a BHSC, but it was not in the famous quote unquote infamous Mac Health Sci program, actually. So funnily enough, I actually got rejected from that program twice, if you can imagine. So what I did at McMaster was, first year I was in life science, so life sciences, and then I transferred over to biochemistry for the second year, and then I transferred over to a newer program at the time. It's called Biomedical Discovery and Commercialization, or that's a mouthful, or BDC for short. Not the bank, not the bank, but that's the actual program acronym. Unfortunately, it's the same acronym at McMaster, which is basically a at the time, like I said, a newer program training scientists to think like business people as well. So there's a combination of science courses and business courses, all specifically aimed at drug discovery or drug development research and commercialization. So that was the whole aim. And that program funneled actually a lot of people into, a lot of people ended up in healthcare careers anyway. So, beyond just medicine, say like pharmacy or optometry or dentistry or, insert healthcare profession there. Or the main aim of the program was to get people into business related roles at big pharma companies or pharmaceutical companies. Think of the Pfizers of the world, the Modernas, the GSKs, the Lillies, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of how I went into it. It was just, I pursued something that was interesting to me and I tried to pursue it to kind of the greatest lengths. And I can get into what happened afterwards with the transitions and, and then the career pivots, if you will. But in a nutshell, that's kind of how it started.
Yeah, that's a lot. Yeah, that's a lot, man. That's a lot that you went through for the program. And there are so many experiences that you can do as you displayed with your own degree that, as we'll get into later on in this conversation, where you have this versatility to go into different areas of science and science technology as well. And I think that also speaks to your experiences, your diversity of life experiences, even early on in your life. And going back a little bit, you mentioned you were born in Canada, but you also lived in Hong Kong for a brief period of time, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, when I was around 2 to 5 years old. Yes.
2 to 5 years old. So you're still really young at that point, but do you remember what was life like back in the early 2000s back in Hong Kong? And what were the similarities between Hong Kong and Canada back then?
Yes, great question. So actually, I'm going to date myself a little bit because this was the late 90s, right? When I was living in Hong Kong, or just like, I spent some time in mainland China as well. So yeah, so back then, so if, people don't know, kind of like, I'll try to set the historical context. So this was literally the first few years after the Hanover meeting, that, when the UK handed Hong Kong back to China, basically, right, as part of the agreement that they set up in the mid 80s. And so because I was very little, I only remember specific snapshots in time, essentially, of kind of like what was going on and kind of what were the uh experiences I had. And of course, if you're in Hong Kong, like, and you don't, and most people don't come from money. So what you do is you kind of live in these huge like apartment buildings. And anyone who has gone to Hong Kong can relate and can imagine or relate to how it feels, because I mean, first of all, space is a premium there, right? And so you would often live in, we weren't living in a cage home, don't worry. Those are very extreme, right? But we were in this, kind of like smallish apartment building. We had a couple of bedrooms. It, had everything for the three of us at the time. So my mom and dad and myself. At the time, this was before my younger brother was born, right? So, and so what I remember is kind of the general layout of that apartment building. And it's funny because I went back to Hong Kong in 2017, and my mom showed me basically the apartment building that we lived in at the time. It's like, okay, that's cool. That, I only have specific, again, recollections. So remember the building. I remember what was going on at the time. And again, this is like late 1990s, right? You think about at the time what was really popular. Titanic. So James Cameron, and Titanic. And I remember we had this little model replica of the Titanic ship in the apartment, and specific T-shirts. And I think I watched that movie, but I didn't understand anything because I was a little child, right? That sort of thing. And at the same time, also, I also remember the first time I ever used a computer was during that time as well. Good old clunky Windows 98. You imagine or remember the really big monitors, the really big ones, right? That used to have in school. I mean, we had one at the apartment, and I mean, like I didn't know what the internet was at the time, so I learned how to play solitaire. I was like, that was the classic game. And then if people remember the pinball game on Windows, the old one, that was a lot of fun. Um, and at the same time, I tried playing Minesweeper as well. I did not understand how to play Minesweeper at all, and I always lost every time. I'm like, I don't get this, so I just left. So that is all like setting the context, and I mean, like I went to preschool there. I went to beginning stage of kindergarten there as well. So I always get confused on whether Cantonese or English is really my first language. But I mean, then again, now it's pretty much English. But I mean, I mean, back then it was like I got early exposure to that, and when I came back to Canada, to start actually kindergarten here, I got placed into ESL right away. um, I don't know why, but I stayed in ESL until I was grade 4. I still don't know why. I was perfect. I think like grade 1 or 2, I was perfectly fine with English, so I have no idea why they kept me there for so long. But yeah, that was kind of like the setting. I remember having a lot of great times. So if you're from Hong Kong, you would know about Ocean Park, which is the original theme park, actually, before Disneyland popped up in the mid 2000s. So Ocean Park, a lot of fun. I remember just having a lot of fun, kind of there. So yeah, that was kind of like my experience, and from that, reflecting on that kind of like experience, however brief, of living like just like in Asia in general, just having it helped me kind of like retain my Cantonese to this very day as well. I speak it with my parents when I go to Chinese restaurants, things like that. So I do retain that part of my heritage, which is I always appreciate kind of that, but also helps me to understand the mindset of people in Asia. I think that especially like in China or in Hong Kong. So that yeah, it helps me understand, right, others who come from a similar kind of background, kind of being that bridge, if you will, between the East and the West. So it was a really interesting experience.
Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned that part because that is going to be something that we will be going to either in this episode or in the later episode. That is a topic that I want to emphasize more also on this podcast, along with other ones as well. I'm glad you mentioned the old days about Windows 98 and the CRT monitors that you had and the CRT TVs back then, because, well, you're older than me by about a year. So
yes,
the
95
tech
and
you grew up
96.
with is the tech that I grew up with as well. I
Yes.
used 95 and 98 as well.
I mean, I tried 95 but before, but like 98 was my first ever computer. Yeah.
Yeah. And Space Cadet Pinball was what you were referring to
Yes.
on Windows XP. So
That's right. A little bit later, but I still remember. Yes.
I think everyone who was born up until maybe 2004, 2005 would remember that game because that was the game if your internet was down or if you were just bored one day and just like, I don't want to be playing an intense game. Just play a game of Space Cadet Pinball.
Something simple, right? And even, back then, this was like before I even got into chess, for example, right? So like, I wouldn't know. So like, pinball was.
Yeah. Do you remember a game called Microsoft Golf?
I do vaguely, yes.
Yeah, Microsoft Golf. I actually searched it up a few years ago and it's actually called Microsoft Golf 3.0, or I think it was Lynx something or whatever.
Okay. Sure.
That was one of the first games that I played as well. It was a really fun little game. It was pretty advanced at the time because it featured real life golf courses like Banff National Park, like Banff National
Okay,
Park course or something, or the
right.
Links or Harbor Town, and all these different
Right.
other.
It's like real world accurate, right?
Yeah,
Okay,
and
you know why that is, right? Because
yeah,
Microsoft also has Flight Simulator. That's why.
yeah, exactly. And back then, those games also had it wasn't DLC, but it was you could buy extra courses and download them onto your base copy of Microsoft Golf 3.0.
Right. So that's like a precursor to DLCs, basically.
Yeah, yeah. So, but I never got that because I, I mean, being a 3-year-old kid, I mean, we don't even know about these places. So
What is
I
this?
never
Right. Yeah.
actually, thought about that. But
Yeah.
no, those were the days. And again, those experiences that you had that you brought in from that, from the cultural experiences, I think are quite important for your later experiences in undergrad and in your master's. And that leads on to my next question. What were the biggest challenges that you faced during your undergrad, and how did you use your early experiences to conquer these challenges?
Yeah. So definitely, I think a lot of people can relate to this in the sense of, there is a really big jump between high school and undergrad, and that learning curve or that gap really depends on kind of where you come from and what your background is. And for me, maybe like it was not as extreme as say like some other people where they would move to Canada for school, for example, or maybe if English isn't their first language. So that is a whole different conversation in and of itself. But for me, really understanding how not only what to study or how to study, or those kinds of conversations, things that like, oh, what do I want to learn or what do I want to focus? How do I learn what to learn? Or, how do I learn best in period? Right. So there were a lot of those kinds of thoughts or conversations running at least inside my head. And I think now it's a little bit better, but even, before I went to undergrad between 2013, 2017, so mid 2010s. And I mean, this has been part of the university or higher education model, learning model for a very long time, in the sense of, well, you have a lot of students, right? Kind of at one, taking the same class at one period of time. What is the most efficient way of evaluating them? Well, it's memorization based exams. That's the most simple way, right? Where there's quote unquote objectively a right answer or and wrong answers, right? And then you would, I mean, there are many different formats, and the easiest which is you just do a scantron and you do multiple choice, right? But this is more true for say like STEM subjects, right? From my experience versus say like maybe your experience was more like writing a lot of essays, right? Or like conveying like thought and arguments and things like that, and in that kind of vein. Um, and so that was kind of my challenge, especially I think as I went to more and more specialized programs, right? With I mean general life side to biochem to BDC, the class sizes got smaller, and so then there's like more specialized attention to the ratio between professor to student decreases, and so um, a lot of times the mode of evaluation changes. So a lot of it did simulate more to what people do in real life. Because realistically, you think about it, no one really memorizes anything for work. Come on, right? Like, it's not a skill. Memorization is not a valued skill in the workplace because resourcefulness actually is a better indicator now because you can look up anything at any time. And there is no need to memorize, although I think memorization is useful in some contexts for fast recall of facts and information. And, as you grow older and you accumulate more information and knowledge and wisdom, really, then, a lot of things will get stored into your long-term memory. I mean, memory science is like, the science of memory is a very fascinating topic. I can probably talk about that for a very long time, but, um, in general, need to learn more about how to do presentations effectively, how to pitch, how to be persuasive, right? How to be a leader, how to write effective essays, right? And write research papers. That was, something that had to learn and to adapt, especially if you're in the sciences, if you're in research, you're going to be reading a lot of papers and you're going to be writing a lot of papers. I mean, I've written my fair share of, 36-page research documents or 60-page research documents, dissertations, thesis, and, things like that. And you have to remember, this is before the era of generative AI, right? That became mainstream. So I did not have ChatGPT to write my whole dissertation for me. I had to actually do it myself, right? Maybe hard for Gen Z to imagine now, but that was kind of like, and now it wasn't even that long ago too, right? And so that was kind of the main thing, was the adjustment and kind of learning what real world skills are valuable versus things that are more arbitrary to, or more related to like the school environment. I don't want to call it artificial, but it is in a way. And I can talk about the state of education for like for hours on end too, and how our current higher education system is not preparing us adequately enough for most jobs out there these days. But I digress. The other thing I think was, for me, like, I was pre-med at the time, and so I had spent a lot of time actually preparing for medical school applications. And so for those who don't know, at least here in Canada, especially here in Ontario, there are a few different things that you have to do. I mean, if you're listening to this in like 2050, I mean, like, maybe things have changed, but what this is true to my experiences when I was applying in the mid 2010s. At the time, I mean, there are just a few things you had to do. So one is like writing the MCAT, which is a standardized test for you know understanding where people lie, just in terms of like their knowledge, right, of the, not only like the hard sciences, not only like biology, chemistry, physics, but all like a little bit of math, but also on the humanities as well. There's actually been an increasing emphasis on the humanities, so such as psychology. I mean, psychology is like kind of that bridge between the hard and soft sciences, if you will. So psychology, sociology, actually. And there's always a test of like reason, um, and like reasoning rather, and English comprehension. So there was that as well. So that kind of the test overall, and it was like, so I did the new version of the test at the time, which is like 7.5 hours long. Now this is like including breaks and lunch and things like that. But it was basically double the length of the original test, which is 3 hours and 45 minutes or so, just because they wanted to add more questions and they wanted to add more sections. So yeah, so that's a rite of passage, I think, for many people applying to medical school. I had to do it twice too, just because my quote unquote English section, or they call it CARS. It's an acronym. It stands for Critical Analysis and Reasoning Skills, I believe. And you can't really study for that section, right? So like my score wasn't like high enough. I didn't think it was high enough to be competitive for medical school. So that kind of section, you can't really study for. You just practice with practice questions. It's basically like reading comprehension and reasoning. So like you read a passage, they'll ask you questions about the passage, and you kind of like deduct, like you use like intuition and deductive reasoning and that kind of stuff. So that's one aspect. Second is obviously your GPA, right, in school, and we're talking like it's also competitive, and especially like back then, but especially these days now. Like really realistically, 3.8 is already kind of low, right, on the lower end of we're using a 4-point scale. So yeah, I've seen people with like perfect 4.0 GPAs not even get to med school. Like it's not competitive now these days, because again, like there's a multitude of different factors. And then third is kind of your extracurricular. So in the sense of what you've done, um, you know, maybe like less emphasis on say like high school things, but definitely what you've done during your undergrad. And a lot of people do a lot of different things to be competitive in that regard. I'd argue also that there is sort of a problem with that, just because I've seen people say like join school clubs or lead school clubs for the sake of putting it in their application rather than actually they actually enjoy it. It is really painfully obvious. I've seen that happen before, and that's a way to game the system, unfortunately. Although for me, like my extracurriculars that I did really was out of interest. Like I actually wanted to do it, or I tried to basically, or if not, then I would just not do it. As simple as that, because there's limited time, limited resources, things like that. And yeah, that was basically my kind of obsession during undergrad. I mean, I won't say that it was all for naught, just because the results, and this continuing from my story, that in 2017 I was actually on the final waiting list at U of T for med school. And so the final waiting list is basically this purgatory, essentially, or this limbo where you are not good enough for like to not saying you're not good enough, but like you don't make the cut to be accepted to medical school, but you're not bad enough that they reject you outright. So you're just like kept in this waiting, because the main thing is, a lot of medical school applicants, apply to other schools as well. So it's very conditional on what schools they accept. And so it was really funny because like I got that waiting list email when I was actually on vacation in China at the time. And so I came back, a couple of weeks later, and that was when I got the rejection email. So that was kind of like what happened then. And long story short, I applied again to med school during my master's degree year, and I was rejected from McMaster. After having an interview, basically. So all in all, that was kind of the main challenges. And now, like reflecting back, I think like I do have some regrets. I think, about like doing like or my undergrad experience. Although I will say, like I had a great time at McMaster. Don't get me wrong. I think that was a really formative experience in my life, or for formative years in my life. There are just a couple of things I wish, or a few different things I wish I did. So one was to actually broaden my horizons more during that time, because I was so tunnel vision to like med school or bust med school, right? I was like there are arguments for or against this kind of like laser focus. Some people are like, okay, this is great. Like if you focus just on one thing and you put your all into it, you will achieve whatever it is. But that's not necessarily the case, right? Because a lot of times, if you require other people to accept you into a program or that sort of thing, a lot of times there are external factors outside of your control, right? Sometimes maybe the admissions committee just don't like you for whatever reason, right? It can be like politics in that way. My second is that I wish I did more internships, actually, or just any internships during undergrad, so that I could be more, say, like adequately prepared for the job market eventually. I mean, because like I was like, oh, I need to focus on studying for the MCAT during the summers, right? Versus like actually getting real world job experience that might have been, exposed me to different perspectives, or like, because I was again so tunnel visioned on medical school, thought that, oh, this is not as important, versus I could have very easily like, just simply like, I don't know, worked at a doctor's office to see how it's like, or some kind of, or some kind of other like research position in the lab to see what it was like. And then third is like not going on exchange, which is like kind of like interesting. And I know how you feel about travel, but like, for me it was like, I saw like other people going to exchange. I mean, it was, to be honest, it was actually virtually impossible to go on exchange with the program I was in. So like it was not going to really realistically happen. But I wish I had the opportunity to study abroad, just to broaden up horizons, and to step away from the pre-med bubble, essentially, like my own mindset, but also with just the people I was surrounded myself with, because everyone else wasn't pre-med, which is great, but then it becomes a bubble, right? This is like all your existence, all you think about. So yeah, that's kind of like my honest reflection, of undergrad. There are some great points, there's some points that weren't necessarily good as well, but overall, this is with any experience I have, any life experience, I take all the learnings from it and just got to move on. So
Yeah, well, that's a really, really, really detailed, great answer to the biggest challenges that you faced during your undergrad and really during your time trying to pursue an MD. I found that specifically with physicians, with going into med school, speaking as also a fellow Chinese Canadian, there is such an emphasis on getting in that it is almost an Olympic sport in and of itself.
that is true. That is true. Actually, like now that you mention it, there are, my parents were never extreme tiger parents in that regard, or even for myself, right? But I know there are, former like classmates or colleagues or whoever that really treated like really seriously like an Olympic sport, right? Like doing everything to pursue that kind of excellence, which honestly I think I do admire, right? That kind of like tenacity and that discipline to chase your goals and chase your dreams, especially if that's what you want, right? And like I can go in the whole spiel about you know about why I think most people shouldn't even pursue med school to begin with,
Hmm.
because I think I'm very passionate, super staunch on the fact that you really have to love the medicine as a field, as an industry in and of itself. If you want to get into med school for any other reason other than the love of medicine and helping people in this way, you should stay clear. That's all I'm going to say.
That's exactly what I tell people about law school. That's
Yeah.
exactly what I tell people about law school. So many people, and I'll speak briefly on the legal profession, or I should say the attitudes toward the legal profession for many people who want to go into the legal profession. Many law school hopefuls, so those who want to get in, have this sense of, oh, I will get into law school, I'll make the most money, I'll have a better lifestyle, that sort of thing. But I often tell people, if you want to make money, law is not for you.
That's what I think is exactly for medicine too.
And
You can make a lot of money, but that shouldn't be your primary motivator.
and when I say that, when I tell people this, more often than not, people are just stumped, quiet, silence, because you would not expect to hear that from someone who's in the profession. Well, at least if you're a layperson who knows nothing about the legal profession, with no one in your
Because
family
you
who's a
think
legal
about like,
professional.
I mean, you think about like the prevailing, I mean, yes, it is that Asian stereotype, right? Of the best professions that people can pursue, right? Everyone always jokes about like, if it's not medicine, if it's not law, if it's not, engineering, insert third subject, you're a failure, quote unquote.
Yeah.
But
Here's the thing, and I think I mentioned this to you in a conversation a few years ago. This was, I think, even before COVID, or yeah, right before COVID, actually. Nowadays, I don't even think the legal profession is now an Asian stereotype, because now I often hear, more often, it's doctor or engineer. Believe it or not,
that's so interesting.
I
Okay.
think about half of the Asian parents that I've known, or half of the Chinese parents that I've known, actually don't want their kids to go to law school because they have some mostly erroneous preconception of the legal profession being a very bad profession, in the sense that it's, quote unquote, advocating for bad morals or advocating for bad things or even evil things. Again, it's erroneous for the most part from many Asian parents. So when I can tell you one thing, when I got into law school back in 2018, around half of the people that I met were not happy. They actually said, I don't want anything to do with you anymore. Literally. So I don't think that the legal profession is an Asian stereotype in some circles anymore. It's really just doctors and engineers now at this time. That being said, there are still some circles that do emphasize law school as one of the stereotypical professions that you should get into, but it's not as common as medicine or engineering, at least in my own personal experience.
See, that's really interesting, right? And I could see where people are coming from just in terms of, again, like it's all like because they haven't been in the profession or studying in the profession, right? That there are all these like stereotypes about, oh, lawyers are evil people or things like that. I mean, well, like it really depends on how you look at it, I think.
Yeah.
Right.
In fact, I remember this one conversation with another person who knew that I was going into law school, and he was very religious. And he said, "Oh, that sort of goes against my religion." I'm sitting here thinking, "What? How do you get that from the legal profession? We're not advocating for a specific religion. In fact, we're pretty much the legal profession doesn't advocate for really any profession. It's impartial in the eyes of the law. Religion doesn't help at all. So, where are you getting this information about the legal profession being inherently against your profession?" Thinking back, I think he was talking about some erroneous misconception of criminal law. So, for example, the classic response that I hear from people is, "Oh, you're defending a murderer." It's more nuanced than that. And first of all, I'm not a criminal lawyer, so
yes, but
wrong area of practice entirely. Second of all, if you ask a criminal defense lawyer, it's a lot more nuanced than that. There is due process. There is due diligence. There are all of these important things that you must do in order for a trial or a hearing to be legitimate. Otherwise, you might as well bring back the dueling law of Canada, where whoever wins a duel between two swordsmen wins and determines whether or not you're guilty. So it's such a weird phenomenon. I think it's starting to change, though, over the last 5 years. But there's still that sort of misconception in the legal profession.
But I think, yes, in general, I think like that is something, you have to like kind of like think about. I mean, like I can kind of speak on a little bit, touch upon the legal thing that you just mentioned, right? In the sense of, well, you think about all the cases where someone innocent was accused of doing, of committing a crime, and they actually got convicted, and now it's like, well, you you you, you basically condemned this innocent person to whatever punishment, and then after it's like, oh, my bad. But like that's the whole point, right? That's why criminal defense lawyers exist in the first place, because maybe their client is actually innocent and they have to defend themselves, right? In that sense. So again, like people like always think, oh, of it like is really really black and white, right? In the sense of, oh, you're just defending a murderer or whatever. And I could say something similar for the medical profession as well. Kind of while we're on the subject, and as you know, I think with the repeal of Roe v. Wade in the U.S., I mean, talk about everything. Like the simple kind of like thought is, oh, doctors who perform abortions are murderers too. That's like, it's way more nuanced than just that, right? So
the thing that I realized with people is that they do not like nuance. They absolutely hate nuance for the most part, because nuances essentially imply that not every correct answer is a fully correct answer. That there are certain things where that correct answer fails or is considered erroneous, wrong, a mistake. And there's this other phenomenon that most people have. And that phenomenon is that they always think that the grass is greener on the other side. Let me put it to you this way. First of all, that's not always true. Second of all, there may be no grass on this side, on the other side. And I find this to be a very common thing with people who know nothing about the legal profession, but it's also, I would assume, a similar thing with the medical profession or with the scientific profession as well. And I don't know if you had any of these sorts of experiences in your personal time.
Yeah, so I mean, maybe not like on a personal level, but I think just take what we've gone through the past like 3 4 years. The amount of misinformation about COVID and vaccines, and oh, don't even get me started on that. I mean, it just ran rampant because I mean everyone's now claiming to be a medical expert, right? Like if I have the loudest voice on the internet, I am I am legally now allowed to put doctor in front of my name. No, it doesn't work like that, right? I think like that's kind of part of the whole like scientific process and the whole like medical process is that of due diligence, like you said before, of evaluating all the evidence and then coming to conclusions, right? Is That's the scientific process, right? Really. And a lot of people kind of, some like a lot of people are ambivalent, but I think a small subset of people who are actively against it or against any sort of rational thought or evidence or I mean that's why conspiracy theorists exist. That's why flat earthers exist. That's why anti-vaxxers exist, right? Because not only do they openly reject what is, by consensus deemed as true in the current state, right, by the scientific community, they openly kind of convey their alternative viewpoints, but in addition, right, kind of like are kind of trapped in this bubble where all they will listen to is or fall victim to is confirmation bias. And so they only want to hear what they want to hear, and they selectively take and reject everything else. But science, you can't do that because you have to consider everything, right? I mean, I think it's the same for any argument, really, right? You have to consider not only like both sides. I think like a lot of like issues like you consider like both sides, but can be like more than two sides to an issue as well. So I think like that's really important, and this goes to just like my message to like just people in general, right? Um, you know, you have to give every viewpoint, no matter how much you disagree with like one viewpoint, you have to acknowledge that A exists and B, you have to actually like think about it and consider it.
People like to talk before they think. People don't typically think before they talk. So when you hear a lot of these, not just wrong arguments, but horribly conceptualized and organized arguments, you can't help but wonder whether or not they thought about it. The answer is most of the time they have not. It's this sense of, as you mentioned, only wanting to hear what you want to hear. Social media is a massive contributing factor to that. You have these echo chambers. You have the reinforcement of a specific opinion or a specific set of opinions. And that's all you hear. And because that's all you hear, and because the algorithm of whatever social medium you're using doesn't give you alternative views or alternative opinions, all of a sudden, when you do run into something like that, you have many people, I should say, do not have that kind of capacity to consider it. For example, you were mentioning about one of our earlier conversations about travel. I want to be clear, there's nothing wrong with travel, but there is a point where you don't have to travel to a place to know about that place. And frankly, sometimes, even if you do travel to that place, you still won't know much about that place. You can travel to a country 10, 15, 20 times and still learn nothing about that country. Or you can also travel to that country once and learn a lot about that country. Now, why do I say this? Because there's one nuanced factor. What are you looking for? If you're only looking for a fun time, if you're only looking for a specific set of experiences that are limited to what is familiar to you, doesn't matter that you're in a different country. You're staying in maybe a Sheraton, or you're staying in a nice westernized hotel, to use an example, and your experiences are more mellow towards that point. What people don't realize is that you can still learn a lot about a different country without even going to that country. You can read about it, you can study about it. Sure, you may not necessarily have the immersion in it as you would by going there, but you can still learn a lot. You can make up for that loss of information or that loss of experience through other means. You can learn about the philosophy. You can learn about the cultural nuances. You can also learn about the day-to-day lives from other people who come from that country, or from other people who are in the diaspora here in your local country, in your local community, discussing about those experiences. I argue that that's actually an even better way of learning things, because you're not just looking at the fun, the extravagant sides about that country or that culture. You're looking at the good and the bad, and those that are in the middle, the neutral parts of that experience as well. Now, look, even me mentioning this idea to a good number of people, they will not take it nicely at all, especially if they are big travelers, right? And again, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that traveling's bad. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that it has its advantages and disadvantages, just as how not traveling has its advantages and disadvantages. It's the nuance and the ability to understand the reasons for why a person wants to travel and does not want to travel. That's what ultimately matters at the end of the day. Now, this is just one example of many examples. Like, I mean, in your examples of medicine, for example, or scientific research, you said it perfectly. Now everybody believes that they are an expert in everything, right? Now, don't get me wrong. If you genuinely are an expert in that area, as in you've studied that area or you spent a good chunk of time challenging yourself and looking at different viewpoints and then providing an opinion on that, great, sure. But you can tell quite quickly whether or not a person knows enough about that area to have a working opinion about that area, just from a simple conversation with them. So I'm rambling a little bit on this point, but I think it's important to bring it up early on here, because in your experiences, because you've dabbled in so many different areas and positions over the years, and now being involved in venture capitalism, I think that's something that you've also seen, right? Between people who know what they're talking about and people who don't know what they're talking about.
Sure, it's very, like you said, it's very clear. Just because, I mean, like you said, I have like dabbled in a lot of different topics, and we can kind of like, we'll continue the conversation about like VC or venture capital and kind of beyond, like just in the technology in general. But I want to like backtrack a little bit to your point about travel, right? I mean, like when people say like, or when like people approach like travel, like there's just always this like kind of like overwhelmingly say like positive view on travel. It's like, oh, travel is good for the soul. Travel can expand your horizons. Travel can help you learn about different cultures. I mean, you kind of like, said that already, or presented the kind of the opposite viewpoint, but a lot of people are like, oh, travel is contributing to to climate change, or your carbon footprint, or you are actively damaging the places that you're going to, the dangers of like volunteerism too, right? On top of that, so there are, like I said, like you said, I mean, upsides, downsides to travel, and right, and to your point, I think about like understanding a place, right? I think like for me, for example, to give an example, I actually have not been to most Asian countries actually yet. I do have an understanding of generally what's going on in each of them, in the sense of, consuming content, consuming media, talking to people who belong to those cultures, right? What are the issues that they're grappling with? I mean, case in point, you talk to people from Japan and South Korea, for example, and they always mention the low birth rate, right? And if they're going on their current trajectory, their countries will literally be extinct in 1,000 years if they don't increase either the birth rate or immigration. I mean, we're talking about two very homogenous countries, so I mean, you take your pick, kind of on that, and so all that is to mention that that's why, like, not only nuance, but I think especially what we're dealing with now, with, like, echo chambers and disinformation, and everyone wants to be an expert, and the world is black and white kind of thing, which is not. For example, as an example, is that we have to bring critical thinking back into vogue. I think that is, or I don't even know if it was vogue, period. But critical thinking is so important, like, it's so crucial to me, and I think it's very crucial just for everyone in general. It's just a skill. It's a very necessary skill, not only in people's personal lives, but also in the workplace as well, right? You have to critically consider and think about not only all different viewpoints, but all different decisions that you could go with whatever information you have. You can either choose to, use whatever knowledge, information you have in a constructive way, right? Like, leveling up in your work, or providing good for your community, versus in destructive ways, in what we've seen with, say, the truckers, for example, right? Or people. I mean, look. I mean, I respect, of course, people's right to protest. That is fine. That is, like, fundamental in, in a Western democracy, or just, like, in, kind of like here. But when, for example, you're actively blocking the way of hospital workers to get to their job to save people's lives, that is kind of like where the line has to be drawn. You can't just protest for the sake of protesting. So,
and that's the thing I also wanted to very quickly jump in on. I think the advent, again, of social media has contributed to this very non-nuanced hatred for anything that even slightly disagrees with a person's
so
own point.
That's the key point. People do not know how to disagree respectfully.
And when I used to host the law school show back a number of years ago, I mentioned this point to Governor General David Johnston. It's the art of civil disagreement, the art of communication. And we talked about this exact point. If we were to look at even political debates back in the old days, and again, I don't want to go into a political conversation, because that's not the whole point.
Politics is but a very good manifestation of this, though.
Yeah. If you were to look at the prime ministerial candidates of the 80s, yes, they disagreed on so many points, and they were a bit heated at times. But at the end of the day, they were strong but not insulting. And I will always remember this comment that I've heard from Prime Minister Paul Martin in my episode with him back on the law school show about 4 years ago now. He said that during his father's time in politics, his father was Paul Martin Sr., cabinet minister under Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King. During his dad's time and his time, for the most part, the political landscape was actually quite healthy. Friendships across political lines were actually healthy. But then in the later years of Prime Minister Paul Martin's years, so this would have been around 2004, 5, or 6, he started seeing the cracks. He started seeing a lot more friendships being broken across party lines. He saw more hostile conversations between different political parties. So that's one big example. Another big example is from the cultural perspective. There's now much more cultural stratification, and you and I being on both the Chinese side and the Canadian side, we see this on a daily basis. It is such a, it's like Jedi and Sith, basically. It's essentially Jedi and Sith. I mean, and I wish I could say this jokingly, but I can't, because number one, the fact of the matter is our cultures do have many significant differences. But number two, those differences are amplified by the current attitudes towards different cultures, right? Sometimes there's open, not just disagreement, but open silencing even of certain cultural opinions, which is, it's unfortunate, especially in a place like Canada. But that's the reality that we live in. And again, I think it all has to do with social media, where now all of a sudden those negative thoughts, those negative voices get amplified in not just in your head, but also in the way how you express yourselves and communicate with other people off of a simple direct private message or on a comment or some other kind of interaction. Which is why, for me, the only times that I'm actually on social media are when I'm running this podcast or when I'm promoting some academic work or philosophical work or whatnot. Outside of that, on a personal level, I frankly don't use social media, with, again, the only exception being that if I absolutely have no way of contacting that person whatsoever, maybe I will use the private messaging function. Maybe. But outside of that, no, social media is I'm 90 to 95% off of social media at this point, because it's too exhausting too.
Right. And I respect, kind of like that stance, honestly. Like, I respect anyone who is, who makes that conscious choice to be offline. And I think that you think about like how our parents' generation, right? We also, like, generations of humans, aside from like, people who grew up in the internet age, have perfectly survived without social media, right? Yeah, it's only now you think about like, obviously, like I come from the technology side too, right? So like you said before, right? The currency of these platforms is attention. That is like what they're monetizing through ads, right? Literally that's how these platforms make money for the most part, right? So the more attention or the more time you spend on these platforms, the more time you spend arguing over some pointless argument, right, online, the more time you consume videos that get you like amped up or, get you angry. The platforms don't care about whether or not you're happy with it. They're just, you want to use it more? You go ahead and use it more. You don't care whether you're happy or sad or mad or whatever, right? And I think I've noticed, like, I mean, if we're talking about like, yeah, the art of civil disagreement, that's kind of like, 2004, 5, 6 coincided with what? I mean, that's when Facebook launched, for example, 2004, right? Or like, that's kind of like when social media became more and more prevalent in people's lives. And so a lot of this discourse has turned, because like people are, relatively speaking, free from social consequences, they can spew out whatever they want online, whatever you know hateful remark or thing in general, or they want to like spew out their disagreements or frustrations or anything, but that's not in a healthy way, because that's kind of like when that noise becomes is unproductive, right? And I'm sure like you understand that, and that's why even for me, as someone who is still very much active on social media, like I still like that is a conscious like downside that you have to do, because people just don't know how to disagree with one another without taking it personally.
Well, social media is an extension of the cultural extroversion that we see in the Western world. Hence why social media as an invention began in the Western world.
Well, it's a Western thing, mainly American thing. Yes.
Yeah. So it encourages and emphasizes extroversion to the extent that introversion is not exactly something that is considered as a good thing. I have some personal examples as well. Some of my more extroverted colleagues have really tried to emphasize me to be more extroverted as if introversion is viewed as a bad thing. And one of them, she used to claim that she was an introvert in the past and then now suddenly discovered her new extroverted self. To be frank, I don't believe that, because judging from her own social media posts back over the many years that she's used social media, she's always been more of an extrovert. Maybe an ambivert, but more on the extroverted side of being an ambivert. But if you want to say an introvert, I don't think so. Because an introvert doesn't usually post a lot about, hey, look at me wearing this, or look at me doing this, how do I describe it? Like you don't want constant attention.
Right, you want like constant attention on yourself.
You don't want that constant attention every week or every day or every week or however many times you post on your social media. You don't want that constant attention of you doing mundane things, frankly. You know, sure. Oh, look at this lunch that I'm trying to eat, or look at this bowl of food I'm trying to eat. Now, I'm not saying that everybody who posts that is an extrovert. That's not what I'm saying. But there's a certain pattern of behaviors that indicate that I don't think you're an introvert, you're an extrovert. And there's nothing wrong with being an extrovert. Different people have different ways of socializing. But what is wrong is saying that one way to socialize is better and more correct. I shouldn't say more correct, the only way to socialize compared to another way of socializing. And in this case, because we live in a world that is now focused so much and squarely on extroversion as a virtue and introversion as a vice, now many people think it's acceptable to say that being an introvert is bad, is wrong, is something that you need to change. That's the wrong way of going about it. And I'm glad that a few years ago, before and during the pandemic, you used to host a podcast called Digital Introverts. And back then, it pretty much exploded in popularity. I think I know the answer to this because we've spoken a lot about this, about introversion in the past, off camera and off record. But why did you start Digital Introverts? And why did you think that it resonated so well with people around the world?
Yes, absolutely. So before I actually jump into answering your specific question, I do want to kind of touch on a few points on what you just mentioned. I mean, kind of like a lot of this conversation about, like social media, extroversion, success, quote unquote, right, is a very cultural one as well. Kind of like notice where, I mean, like even you think about like, Dale Carnegie's book, like How to Win Friends and Influence People, like literally, like that's kind of like, right, the West, especially US, has always been that like culturally like extroverted, right? And that has, of course, permeated into our online spaces, right? It's always been that like, oh, you have to talk more to, get noticed and, do good work and, right, things like that. And where introversion is seen that as that, like you said, just like no one wants to be an introvert, that sort of thing, right? So versus, I think like in the East, right, especially like in East Asia, for example, or just Asia in general, right, it's the opposite, where introversion is actually seen as more of that virtue and extroversion is like more of that vice, right? So there's such a super interesting kind of conversation in that. And I wanted to also touch upon kind of the like because of that, right, we have had those conversations where it's like, even I've like been told this too, right, to speak up, to speak louder, to be out there more, right? I don't understand you, right, when you just want to listen most of the time, right? And actually, like my preferred way of like interacting with people, I actually just let the other person talk most of the time. I prefer listening, right? And so that is very like introverted trait. And you're mentioning about like extroverts on social media, and kind of like this is a preamble to digital introverts. But I mean, now, I mean, like, I don't necessarily consider myself introvert anymore. I'm actually more of that ambivert, right? That kind of in the middle. And people have seen this transition over the years. I don't know, like you kind of noticed that, where I'm more active and kind of like talking to more people, but I still retain those core some of those core introverted tendencies where I like my alone time still. I like to recharge, right, by myself, and things like that. And so hopping back on the question about, why digital introverts, I think I've told this to you before and like, spoken to on guesting on other podcasts as well. I originally wanted to write a book, actually, on this exact topic. And, I started interviewing people on it, started interviewing introverted, so like, people from all walks of life, usually entrepreneurs or usually like business people, but just,
You interviewed me too, so
yes, I know. Yeah, I mean, if you want a reference, I mean, like the podcast is still up, so feel free to listen to us like 4 years ago, kind of talking about these specific points. But back then, like I had collected all these interviews, and you know, and but this is like 2019, and then I suddenly got invited by one of my other good friends to guest on his podcast, and at the time, I didn't know what a podcast was. It was, what is a podcast, right? And then I realized that, oh, it's basically just, if you boil it down or distill it, it's basically just a recorded conversation, right? In the simplest form.
it's radio without the live portions of it.
Basically, it's async radio in a way. Let's just put it that way. So, and like I got on the show and I was like, oh, maybe this is a faster way of disseminating all the research that I did, with people on the book and just having a live conversation. So that's kind of how I started Digital Introverts. And, I started planning for it late 2019, started recording a bunch of episodes in early 2020. And the next thing you know, lockdown happened. And so I was like, oh, I guess I should launch now because this is never a better opportunity because everyone's now at home. And so, started to release episodes and then continued recording episodes. And so I think like that's kind of how it happened. And it was really funny, like the phenomenon in the sense of like now extroverts are forced to be more to experience an introvert's world. And some people, I mean, there are some people who couldn't handle it, some people who made the most of it, some people embraced it in different ways. And probably for you and I as more, introverted people, this is this is great. Like, we can just work from home or stay at home and kind of do all this stuff, right?
It's like, if I can jump in, it's like that joke where look what they have to do to mimic even a fraction of my power, right? Like this is our daily life, and if I can jump in on this as well, I still am very much an introvert. I still prefer these kinds of conversations. I still like my alone time. What I told you back on the Digital Introverts 4.5 years ago is still very much true today. Nothing's changed. If anything, I've become a bit more introverted. And for many people, they've told me that I don't seem to be introverted. Why? Because, well, I'm doing announcing. I'm a lawyer. I'm on my feet talking a lot more than what the average person would need to do in their daily work. But I tell them, that doesn't mean that I can't be an introvert. You can still do all of these things and still be an introvert. It's really the way how you socialize with other people. For example, if I speak in public, as I said on your podcast on Digital Introverts, I said, I'm not looking at 300 people. I'm looking at 300 parts of one collective person. That's how I mentally and intellectually conceptualize my audience, whether it's a sports broadcast, whether it's this podcast, or whether I hypothetically am mooting or on a court setting where there's X number of people who are sitting in the gallery of that courtroom. But I'm still very much an introvert in the sense that, again, I prefer one-on-one conversations, maybe small group conversations. I don't like talking about celebrity gossip. In fact, that sort of stuff it bores me. I like talking about the deep subjects, like what I do on this podcast. Again, what we talk about on this podcast and what I talk about on other episodes of this podcast, I talk about them off camera and off the mic. So for me, very much so, this is daily life. It's not something that you just, oh, I get to be an introvert for a day. No, this is literally who I am for a long time. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's a difference between introverts and hermits. Very big differences.
Yeah. So, I mean, if we wanted to actually go into it, I mean, introverts are exactly what you described. Hermits actively reject the outside world, actually, and they want to just stay within like their own world, their own sphere of influence, essentially, right? And it's interesting because kind of like how you describe your experience with like sports announcing and being a lawyer, and you know, professions that people may seem or they may react. It's like, oh, only extroverts can tend to do this. I mean, think about I think about like kind of one of the most pivotal books like I've read, Quiet by Susan Cain, and her in that she reflects on her time being a trial lawyer, and she's basically talked about the same things that the same experiences that you've had in the sense of like, you know, yes, even though like like it's a profession where you kind of like speak a lot and things like that, that she still is very much an introvert at heart, right? And so that's kind of like with the success of like the book and the TED talk actually that initially kind of blew up right online. That's when she basically made you know that into actually her entire career now, which is great because that's even better suited for her as an introvert than like still being a lawyer, for example. And it's really interesting, and like this is kind of like how also like I think about kind of like we'll get into this later, but like this is how I think about how I want to live my life, right? Kind of in the future, and what are some things that you consider right lifestyle wise, not like oh like yes like I am in the middle now, right? So that's why like for the extrovert side of me it's like oh that's why I go to networking events, that's why I go to dinners and kind of these other like more social functions. But then there's still that introvert side of me where it's like I actually really prefer like these one-on-one conversations, honestly. Right? That's kind of like why I do a lot of these conversations with other people, in that I want to get to know them on a deeper level, have these deeper level conversations. That's why I recharge by myself. That's why like I spend a lot of my time by myself, actually, either working on something or just enjoying the peace and quiet.
So do I.
uh,
So do I. Yeah, that's essentially what I do too. If I'm not at work, I usually spend time on my own doing other projects and doing other hobbies as well, which are typically things that I do on my own. Another good example, I think, of introversion, and despite an extrovert, well, the I should say the illusion of extroversion when it's actually introversion. A good example of that is classical music performance. If you look at many of the top pianists in the world, many of them are not extroverted. They're not. Off the stage, off camera, off mic, they are introverts. Speaking as someone who is a classical pianist and who has performed in the past, I'm an example of that. But there are even better examples of that. There are pianists who have gone further than I have. I won't name names, of course, because then I'd be putting people on blast at this point. But that's another example. Just because a person appears to be a certain way doesn't mean that they actually are that way. So, especially in a society like Canada or the US, where there is this default emphasis on being the most extroverted person that you can be, being the most unique or distinctive person that you can be, it is an entirely different world and very, very difficult. And it comes as a massive culture shock to them when they're faced with the complete opposite of that, where you're not, where, for example, in our culture, it's for the most part the opposite of that. There are some nuances, and I want to bring up those nuances that Professor Katat Sang mentioned in an earlier episode of This is Legend of. There are elements where we do have to stand up for ourselves, where even if 1,000 of other people disagree with us, we still go forward. There are those nuances. But for the most part, day-to-day life, in our culture, we emphasize more on the collective, right? The collective, what our actions, what the effects of our actions, rather, our consequences will have on the people around us. So, how will our actions affect our families, our friends, our colleagues, our loved ones? We tend to think about that a lot more by default compared to the West. And when that happens, that time and energy being spent into thinking that way is immense. And because we require a lot of time and energy to think that way, we tend to be more reserved. We tend to be quieter. We tend to keep to ourselves or to the people around us a lot more. So I think, at least this is maybe a hypothesis, it may be flawed, but I think my hypothesis about this is that emphasis on thinking about other people, or that default towards thinking about other people, in many ways affects and contributes, or may even be a causal factor to our introversion, individually and also as a culture. So, yeah, I'm rambling a little bit on this point, but I think that's a major causal factor that has led to this, a major one.
Okay, that's really interesting. Okay, maybe like we should really field test this, but it's an interesting hypothesis, at least to think about as a thought experiment in general. Because I mean, this is very much, I think, like true in my life. Like I do think a lot about others in the sense of, like how to, like what is the nature of a relationship, and how to deepen those relationships, for example, right? Versus say like, we talk about the individualism of the West. It's like me, I only focus on myself, right? If I can attain whatever, regardless of how many people are harmed on my way, or like disregard on my way, if I can reach that self-actualization, that's all I care about. But like that's also kind of a flawed way of thinking. And I think like, because in our unique situation, being Chinese Canadian, I think like we do have, of course, adopted some elements of both, right? Thinking about like the collective versus the individual, and then you have that like that balance, right? At least for me, like I'm like fairly balanced. Like I know what I want to do, but it's also, well, I have to take care of like others as well.
Yeah.
And not saying that like we should all kind of like blanket statement the West is like just being hyper individualistic, but of course, like there are many different cultures, right? Of course, being in the West as well. But by and large, how we think about this is really important, not only for in terms of how we think about ourselves, how we think about others, but also how we think about how we work and how we play and how we interact, right, with others as well. And there's no real correct answer. I do have to emphasize that it is just people's preference.
And it's just different. It's just different. Like you said, there's no one right answer or one wrong answer. It's just different. And this is also yet another cultural difference that I found. So much of Western philosophy follows the law of the excluded middle, where one side is 100% correct and one side is 100% wrong, if those two sides were to come into an argument. But for Chinese culture, we have the doctrine of the mean, which means that if two people or two parties are arguing, both sides are right and wrong to varying degrees. This is a concept that, surprisingly enough, many Canadians and Americans struggle to understand, because it's so core. It basically, to understand that, I would assume that for them, it's almost like they have to change their entire way of thinking, or a substantial part of their entire way of thinking, to even consider that. Now, speaking as a lawyer, I actually think that if you were to look at Western cultures and Chinese culture, for example, and you were to compare them in a mediation setting, because here in Canada, in the Canadian legal system, we usually try to settle and mediate before we go into trial. I would argue that Chinese culture tends to do a better job of mediating and negotiating than Western culture does. Surprisingly enough, and I'll tell you why. Because we have this daily notion of the doctrine of the mean, where both sides are right and wrong to differing degrees, in mediation, that translates very well into that structure. Because in mediation, it's not about who's 100% right and who's 100% wrong. It's about where are we willing to meet in the middle to settle this case once and for all. Yes, one side may be mostly right, and one side may be mostly wrong. But especially in civil litigation where there's liability and balance of probabilities and potentially even contributory negligence, you also have that to consider, right? Now, I'm not saying that Westerners aren't good at negotiating. They are, hence why we've got the Bretton Woods Agreement of the 1940s, putting America as, well, the American dollar as a leading currency. What I'm trying to say is that from step one, from a core thinking perspective, I find that Chinese culture tends to do a better job on step one in negotiating compared to Canadian culture. Now, that being said, it also comes down to the individual person negotiating. At some point, maybe the Chinese person may not do as well in negotiating as a very traditionalized Canadian person eventually. And again, it comes down to different people and their different preferences and their different character or personalities. But I tend to find that from a cultural level, Western cultures, especially nowadays, tend to focus more on I'm 100% right, you're 100% wrong, and there's no room for negotiation. And if there is room for negotiation, I am still 100% right no matter what. I know a lot of people are going to disagree with me on this, and it might be a bit heated. I can only imagine that it might be some heated arguments about this. But I think, at least from my own experiences, that's what it appears to be.
See, now that is something to chew on for sure, right? Because we think about, right, negotiation, right? You kind of talking about the traditional Western mindset of like you come into it already presupposing that I'm the one who's right. Therefore I need to take over this versus recognizing that, oh, there's maybe something that like I'm at fault or kind of like I like need to let go, right? And I think especially for negotiation, like I'm not as like well versed in this field in particular, but I think in negotiation there is needs to be some, give and take, right? Or so like compromise is really the word I'm looking for, right? That is like really like that is kind of how you meet in the middle and kind of resolve the conflict or whatever. Because like if like one side or both sides actually just want to like 100% take over one or the other, it's not going to work usually, right? And I think about this in the context of just I think people like human beings in general. Think about when, say, like for example, when someone gets into hot water or someone is criticized for some action, right? It doesn't matter what it is, right? Whether it's like super public or not. People tend to do this black and white labeling of people as either they're 100% inherently good or 100% inherently evil or bad, when reality is we're all good and bad at the same time, just again as a spectrum to varying degrees, right? I like it'll be foolish for me to sit here and say that I've only done good in my life. Of course I've done bad things. Like of course I've messed up before. Of course I've failed before. But does that preclude me from being a good person overall? Probably not, right? Versus say like, oh, I mean, when you think about like, from the legal side of things, okay, sure, someone has committed murder. That's really bad thing, right? And you should go to prison for that. But does that preclude them from rehabilitating and coming out, better on the other side? Does that? Yes, of course. Committing a crime to that magnitude, yes, of course, you'll have a stain on that for the rest of your life. But does that preclude someone from changing, right, or becoming a better person after the sort of the time? Not necessarily, right? And so that person is like, it's still that kind of like there is good and bad in that person. It is just how it is.
And for some people in Canada and the US, their answer is I don't even care what that answer is. I don't even care whether that person has a chance to change. I only believe what I want to believe and what I want to feel. And that's also another thing about Canadian culture. And again, speaking as both of us being born and raised in Canada, that's a very interesting thing to look at because for many Canadians, especially post social media, they only want to believe the things that support their own argument. And they note how I said they want to believe those things. There's a really good, frankly, made by Nate Haggins, Professor Nate Haggins, who hosts a podcast called The Great Simplification and focuses more on the meta crisis of the different problems that are facing human civilization and our existence as a species. He notes that one big problem in Western cultures, and for the record, he is American. He says that one big problem with Western cultures is that it's a wants-based system. It's a desire-based system. It doesn't focus enough on the needs-based system, not what I want, but what I need. This is why when you see a lot of the posts on social media, it's not necessarily because they need to post it. It's because they want to post it. They want to post a side of themselves. They want to present a part of themselves that they want people to see and what they themselves want to see in themselves, what they perceive themselves to be, rather than looking at what they need, what their perception needs to be, and who it genuinely matters to. This is a very difficult concept for a lot of people to experience. And frankly, even in the Chinese diaspora, there's also that issue as well. But I think in the 21st century, and this started really since 20th century, but we're seeing it continue to evolve in the 21st century, it's this wants-based system, this desire-based system of approaching life, of approaching everything that you do in your life as a whole. And as you mentioned, that could lead to a nefarious selfishness that can come out of that. I'm not saying that everyone who does this becomes selfish. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that there is a slippery slope that can lead to selfishness if you are not careful about it.
Right. Yes, absolutely. And that's kind of like how the world is. I mean, unfortunately, right? But it's like the question becomes, is there anything we can do about it? Right? Can we convert back from that wants-based system to a needs-based system? I mean, given kind of like how things have progressed, maybe it seems unlikely, but I mean, I'm a huge believer of like change really comes down ultimately to the individual, right? And if they want to change, right? So
yeah, absolutely. I was thinking about Dunbar's number.
yes.
Dunbar's number it's a bit controversial because of the exact number. You can't really pinpoint a number, but it is a very good benchmark as to
It's
determining
a good concept. Yeah, I think the number is slightly arbitrary, but it's a good concept nonetheless.
So for those who aren't familiar with Dunbar's number, it is the number of meaningful connections, the maximum number of meaningful social connections that you can have with human beings. The number at a given time, the number is around 150. Now, why do I mention this number? As everybody should know by this time, as of the recording of this podcast episode, we have over 8 billion humans living on this earth. It is physically, cognitively, and psychologically impossible to meet every single person on this world and to know them in a meaningful way from the beginning to the end of your life. Even if you were to live 1,000,000 lifetimes, 1,000,000, I should say, Western lifetimes, so 80 something years old, you still couldn't even catch even a fraction of the number of people who are living on this earth. So I find that, and I think that because there are so many people on this earth, even ignoring social media as a whole, you can do something and be relatively anonymous for the most part and get away with that because there are at least 7.9 billion people or 7.99 billion people who don't even know you've ever existed because you're not a part of their Dunbar's number and they're not a part of your Dunbar's number. And for many people, this is a scary concept because especially in modern life, well, I would argue at any point in human history, people always want to strive for meaning. They want to matter to something. They want to matter to this world. And they want their...
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. You said it perfectly. They want a legacy to leave behind on this world. It becomes heartbreaking, painful, and too uncomfortable for them to consider the fact that give it 70 or 80 years into the future, no matter how famous, successful, or well-known that you are, you will be forgotten. And there will come a time where no one will ever know that you even existed. That's a scary concept for a lot of people. But for me, it's actually a comforting concept. I mean...
you don't want to be remembered?
Well, I mean, think of it this way. Think back to a time before you were born. You can't do it, can you?
No, because you don't physically exist. Yeah.
So then it follows then after you're gone. Think about a time after you're gone. You can't do it, can you? If it's not painful to think about what happened before you were born, then it shouldn't be painful to think about what happens after you're gone. Now, this is going to be a very existential kind of topic that we're getting into, and I understand that this is going to be something that people are very uncomfortable about, but that's the reality.
But it's fascinating to think about because you think about now, first of all, like we'll get into like existentialism later, but I want to focus on like history, right? Think about all of most importantly, recorded human history, right? From the ancients to now. You think about the figures that, have like over time been remembered. And then you realize how actually few of them they are relative to all the millions and billions of humans that have walked this earth before us. It's just so few and far between. And, most of the people that were remembered were people who were leaders or had money or influence to even be remembered in the first place. Right? And even now, sure, everyone, if you have some sort of social media, you can leave a digital footprint. Sure. But like you were saying about Dunbar's number, like, I'm sorry to break it to you, no one will care in about a generation or 3 generations time, unfortunately, outside of your immediate family, right? So, and even then, like your great grandchildren, like just think about like your grandchildren, you don't even get a lot of time to like interact with their grandparents, relatively speaking. Think about your great grandchildren. They'll just see you as like this historical figure. They're not even in their life. I mean, if you have the blessing of like meeting your great grandparents in person, that's great. But you go into like future generations, they'll just see you as another historical figure, and no one else outside your immediate family will care, unfortunately, unless you're in the history books or something, right? So,
and even if you are in the history books, you can still be forgotten. You can still very much be forgotten. So, good examples are the pharaohs of Egypt.
I mean, you think about like most pharaohs, aside from King Tut, Cleopatra, Ramses the whatever number, right, are forgotten. At least like for me, right? Those are the ones I remember, right?
And here's the thing. So a good example is this. So King Khufu was a pharaoh who is commonly known as the one who also commissioned the building of the pyramids of Giza that we see in the modern day. But Let me put it to you this way. 15 seconds ago, when I was talking about, before I talked about King Khufu, how many of you in the audience knew who he was? Probably
See,
none of you.
yeah, see, like I needed that jog of memory to even remember in the first place.
But here's the thing. He was one of the most important pharaohs of his time. He was revered as a deity by among Egyptians. Yet, nowadays, most people don't even know who he even is, or the fact that he even existed. If that can happen with a person who is that well known, that revered, that deified, that worshipped, imagine an average commoner like you, me, or the person listening to or watching this podcast. I'm not saying this to make ourselves look little. What I am saying is that that is the reality. That ultimately is the reality. Whether you like it or not, you can be the most successful lawyer in the world. You can be the most successful doctor in the world. You can be the most successful social media influencer in the world. And by saying influencer, I get a bad taste in my mouth, honestly.
I actually really don't like the word influencer.
Yeah. It's ugh.
Yeah.
But regardless of how successful you are, you could be the most successful Olympic athlete in the world.
Sure.
But eventually, no one will even know you ever existed. No one. Absolutely no one. And there will come a time when humanity will cease to exist. And guess what? There won't even be a single being by that time that would have even known that humanity ever existed. Let that sink in for a moment. That's not easy. Now, what does that mean for us now? Well, that doesn't mean that we should just throw up our hands up in the air and just give up right
we
now.
give up. We're done here. No.
For as long as you are still conscious, you can still live your life as if it matters. A good example of this is Albert Camus. He talks about how the pursuit of life, of the meaning of life, is irrational and absurd because humans won't be able to find it. But despite this, you can revolt against the meaninglessness. Look at the myth of Sisyphus, for example, as a positive thing. He loves rolling that rock up the hill for it to roll back down and to continue doing that for all eternity. He loves it. Just as how we can still choose to pursue the things we want to pursue in our own lives, however long or short that they are. Albert Camus had children. He had family. He wrote many books. He was a Nobel laureate. So it's not an excuse for you to just throw your hands up in the air and say, I give up. No, you can keep going. You can keep on going. How you choose to keep on going is your choice. Where you choose to go is your choice. But you can define that. And the people around you can also help you define that as well. This is where I think combining both the Western and the Chinese cultural approaches really works. Because we have the individual and the collective working together in harmony. But also it maximizes your liberty as well.
Absolutely. I think that's such a great worldview to kind of ponder, consider, also the kind of adopting it into your life as well, right? I mean, yes, sure. I mean, you kind of like take all that existential thought we just talked about earlier, and like very easily it's like, okay, great, right? Life is meaningless. I mean, that's, kind of thing. Or we can, right, rebel against the meaninglessness, as you mentioned, and actually make something of yourself, right?
Yeah.
And yes, sure. I mean, people might not remember you, but it's like you have to consider, like, it's like here and now, right? You don't worry about what has happened in the past. Don't worry about what is going to happen in the future. You can focus on the present, focus on what you want to do, what kind of impact you want to leave, right, on kind of the people around you. And that's all you can ask for, because, life is too short to kind of mope around and do nothing, right? So,
and this is also something that I want to bring up 2 points. Number one, you can tell by even the language that we use, wanting to do something. It's so ingrained in our own verbal conversations that saying we need to do something, we can still say that, but we're so used to saying we want to do something that becomes the default norm for us. So you can do whatever you want or whatever you need to do. Second point that comes in, and this is kind of going a little bit off into a different gear. There's this really good philosopher, modern philosopher, by the name of Alex O'Connor. He hosts a podcast called Within Reason. He's actually younger than us. He's around 24, 25 years old. Oxford trained, very talented philosopher. He made a proposition that free will does not exist because everything that we can do and everything that we cannot do, everything that we can imagine and everything that we cannot imagine is defined by processes and biological elements of ourselves that we cannot control. So even what we want to do is controlled by those processes. Even if you were to not want to do something, you would have to want to not want to do that thing. But that still means that you're being controlled by your biological processes or by things outside of your control. And no matter how far you push that envelope, eventually you will hit that wall where you don't have that ability to that intrinsic ability to completely separate yourselves from your biological processes. So everything that you do and everything that you do not do is simply because the Big Bang happened, basically.
I mean, we exist because of the Big Bang, first of all, right? I mean, we'll take a very specific example. No matter how hard I train, I go into the gym or practice, I will never make it into the NBA because I am constrained by genetics. I am not that tall, right? So that's like the simplest example that pops in on top of my mind, right? You know those those people who are always described like, oh, you can do whatever you want. That's a lie, actually. You cannot do everything that you want.
You know what Alex O'Connor said? You can't do whatever you want. You can only do what you want. Because that's all you can do.
Oh, okay. That's a good way of looking at it, too.
Because that encompasses everything that you will do and will not do, and everything that you can do and cannot do. Right? So it's a fascinating, and frankly, he convinced me. So I don't think that there is such thing as free will. I do think that there is such thing as a predetermined set of actions that you can do, but there is no. Well, there's one destiny, and that is everybody dies. But
I mean,
aside from that, you have a predetermination of set probabilities that you can do something or you cannot do something.
Yes, I mean, given a lot of factors, right? You think about where you're born has to do a lot with it, how you're raised, what type of environment, right? There's so many constraining factors, right, into this, and so. I mean, more and more, I am a lot of people always idealize that, oh, free will, it's like you can do whatever. But in reality, there's so many constraints, both biologically and also situationally, that no, you actually cannot, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect example. Can you fly? No, you can't. You don't have wings. And even if you did eventually have wings, you evolved to that point anyways. So you still couldn't control even that, right? Even if you could fly or you could eventually fly, you still couldn't control the biological processes.
No, that's natural selection. To that point. That's evolution by natural selection. That's not in your control.
So literally, and that's what I'm saying. And that's what Alex O'Connor was saying. You can't do whatever you want. You can only do what you want because your wants and not wants are defined by preconceived biological processes over millions, if not billions of years. So there's a good joke in one of the comments of that video where it was like a person fails the test and their mom asks them, "Why did you fail that test?" And the kid answers, "It all started 13.5 billion years ago."
yeah. I was predestined to fail this test.
Or predetermined.
Predetermined, rather.
Because in my opinion, there's no such thing as predestination. There's predetermination. There's a list of probabilities that will happen or will not happen. Well, that may happen and that may not happen. But right. Whether or not they actually happen depends really on the circumstances. There's no set path towards something.
Yes,
there's a set of paths.
Yeah, that's a clear or explanation of the difference, right? Predestination is refers to there's only one way versus predetermination. There is a set of probabilities.
Yes,
of what's happening. So
exactly. For example, And I hear this a lot with married couples that people say, oh, we were destined to meet. No, you were not. You were predetermined to meet because of your geographical circumstances, of your social circumstances, how you came to meet, right? But it could very well be that that other person, that you could have married a different person with the same social circumstances, the same geographical circumstances, but you could have married that other person as well. You weren't predestined to do everything that you did today. You were predetermined to do so. Now, this might be a little bit confusing for some of our audience to listen to that, because their thought is, well, if you don't have free will, then that means everything you do has already been laid out to you 100%.
Whatever.
Well,
yeah.
Yes, that's true, but not a set one singular linear path. It's not just what you can do, it's what you cannot do. That doesn't necessarily mean it's destiny, it's just predetermination.
Yeah, you can kind of think about it in, or at least like I think about it in terms of like a decision tree, basically, right? There's like, imagine like you're this node and this like, decision tree, go to the next decision, and there are like multiple different paths, right? And you can go on whichever path, but no matter like, how much you kind of like deviate from your original path, there is still a set amount of paths that you can go on, right? Because like you were just mentioning before about 8 billion people with Dunbar's number, like yeah, like you can only like there is, no matter how hard you try, you will never get to experience everything. You'll never get to do everything just because you are just constrained. Like we are in a constrained universe or biological system. That's it, right? So yeah, I mean, take that for what you will, but that's kind of how I think about it.
There are a number of points that I think would be a good response to that. First of all, there's the issue of the fear of missing out. And
FOMO, as some other people might call it.
And once again, that is further amplified by social media, where everyone thinks that they want to, well, I shouldn't say everyone, where most people think that they got to experience everything in life, and if they don't, they're missing out. This, I think, can be countered by some cultural notions within Chinese culture where it's okay to miss certain things. It's okay to not be able to do certain things. You're not missing out on that necessarily, right? Because there may be a better set of experiences that may come out afterwards anyways. Another response to what you were saying and what we've been talking about so far on this topic is, for a person who is listening or watching this particular topic, there's a set of responses or reactions that they could have to this. They can take some positive responses or some negative responses or somewhere in between. Now, what do I mean by saying that? For negative responses, they can adopt a very morbid approach to all this. And one example of this would be a very poignant line in a very metaphysical game called The Stanley Parable. One of my favorite games because it basically, it's not a criticism in a negative sense. It's more of a commentary on how games are and how the player interacts with the game, and also it breaks the fourth wall a lot. Well, there's one particular pathway, and I won't spoil exactly which pathway it is, but I will say that there is that one line where it says, where every path you can walk has been paved and laid out for you long in advance, death becomes meaningless, meaning life the same. Do you see now? Do you see that Stanley was dead the very moment he pressed start? Now, this is a very morbid way, in my opinion, of looking at it. That means that for some people, if they hear what we're talking about, they would automatically assume that if every path that I can walk and every path that I cannot walk has been paved out for me long in advance because of my biological and evolutionary processes, that means my death is meaningless. And that means my life is meaningless too, which is true on a certain point of view. We were talking about like absurdism or existentialism. But that doesn't mean that you have to live in a way that makes it look meaningless. Existentialism, for example, brings up a pretty good point on this. You can create subjective meaning. Now, personally, I have some issues with the argument of subjective meaning because I question whether even those actions have any kind of meaning in them. But I do see the argument of people who say, oh, you can make subjective meaning through your life. Maybe life doesn't have objective meaning. Maybe there isn't some intrinsic goal at the end of time where all of a sudden everybody achieves their full potential. But in your individual lives, to the people and to the beings, to the entities around you, you could make meaning out of that. That's where the subjectiveness comes from. It's subjective, but it could be subjective meaning. Now, I'm oversimplifying a lot of things in existentialism and also by extension absurdism as well. I mean, we're
barely scratching the surface here.
Right? Exactly. But I'm just saying this like as in one potential interpretation that could be a bit more positive on that standpoint. Or you can believe that everything has meaning, and you can do that as well, right? There are different approaches to living life. And I think that's what makes it fascinating for a lot of people. Hopefully, at least. I mean, for me, this is what I.
This is what you engage in on a regular basis, and I want to preface this, like you know, what I'm about to say, also with a caveat is that like we're not trying to prescribe a certain way of living or a certain view of like how to live your life. Of course, if you want to inject it with a lot of meaning, that's great. You think life is meaningless, you know, go ahead, be my guest too. But you know, all of what we're trying to say or trying to show is that, you know, not only that there are different ways, but this is kind of how we think about it, right? In the sense of, even for me, I used to believe, you know, a while ago, even from my pre-med days, that, you know, I was not saying that I was like destined to become a doctor, but it was more of a, I really want to do this, right? You know, if we're talking about that. And when that didn't happen, actually my worldview was shattered in the sense of like, why is the universe conspiring against me to become a doctor? I did think about that for a little.
Well, it all started 13.5 billion years ago.
In the Big Bang, apparently, right? But then, you know, you have to learn how to, you know, deal with that reality, take that information. I could have easily just, you know, said that, you know, the universe is working against me or whatever, this sucks. Or I could take another path in my realm of possibilities and, you know, continue with that. And that's kind of what I chose. The latter was what I chose to do. And for me now, you know how like a lot of people always describe, oh, you know, like I want to achieve my dream goal of XYZ, right? That kind of thing. I no longer have that view of life in the sense of like, I don't have this like one goal that I'm like reaching towards. And then if like I reach this goal, I'll be like 100% satisfied. There is no destination for me anymore. For me, I'm just, you know, contemplating existence, experiencing existence, living existence, and trying to enjoy the journey for what it is. And for me, that's why I like to like, that's why, like for me, fundamentally, my core philosophy in terms of like why I want to try as many things as possible is because I just want to see, you know, I want to try, even though it might be, you know, futile, to, you know, explore the all, you know, as many of the different paths as I can, because I enjoy the process for what it is.
After all, you can only do what you want to do.
Exactly.
So yeah. So we're going to do something a little bit different for this episode. So we're going to close this episode here, but I would encourage the audience to stay around and stay tuned for the next episode, because Godwin and I will be recording multiple episodes to continue our conversations. To give you a bit of a context, our conversations, again, this is what we typically talk about in our conversations, albeit a bit more free-flowing because we want to give a more coherent conversation on record, of course.
Yes, this had more structure.
But generally, again, aside from the structure, 99% of what we talk about is what we talk about even off camera and off mic. And I remember one conversation, this was actually the day that we recorded the Digital Introverts podcast episode. Our conversation lasted 12 and a half hours.
I remember.
That was the record.
My record.
Yeah.
My record to this day. Yeah.
Yep. Still my record to this day as well. So, but what we're going to do is we're going to close this episode here. If you want to learn more about Godwin's work. Well, first of all, Godwin, where can they follow you?
This is so funny given our conversation on social media earlier, but
I know.
for me, like my name is Godwin Chan, of course. You can find me three the three main social media platforms that I actually like use on a regular basis: LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram. Really, it's just my name. I mean, my handle is like Godwin HS Chan on them, all lowercase. I'm the, I mean, the profile picture might change in the future, but for now, it is me with a bow tie, actually. And a lot of people, and this is a fun tidbit, a lot of people ask, like, oh, where'd you kind of like, why the bow tie? I actually used to like go to events, like dress to the nines with that bow tie. And so I got known to be like a bow tie guy. And this was before, like, I started dressing down for events. And so it's always like, I guess, like stuck with me. But yeah, that's kind of like where you can find me. I try to create as much like positive content in general. Like I like to share my writings on those platforms, things like that. So and sometimes I share about like these topics as well. So if you're interested, come follow me.
Definitely. And I would highly encourage everybody in the audience to follow him on his content as well. It's, again, very fascinating content. And thank you for tuning into this episode of This is the Legend of. This is the first part of many episodes to come with Godwin Chan. He will be a regular fixture on this podcast. To be honest, he's also one of the reasons why I was inspired to make this podcast in the first place as well. So you'll definitely see and hear more of him in the future. But until then, subscribe to the channel. If you like the video, of course. And if you want more, subscribe and click the bell notification icon so you won't miss a single upload on the YouTube side. And also follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, thank you once again for tuning in to this episode. Stay safe, stay healthy, and stay legendary.